Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lucy. I'm the coordinator of the new International Bookshop, and I'd like to give a warm welcome to Hannah Proctor for joining us today and talk about their book, Burnout. I'd like to acknowledge that my little bit of the Zoom is on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nations. I want to pay my respects to the elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And when we're talking about both political resistance and unfortunately political defeat, I think it's really important to think about the First Nations peoples of the country of Australia, but also all around the globe, some of the struggles which Hannah talks about in their book. And I think it's just important to think about that. When we're having these discussions. I'd also like to send my love and my solidarity to the people of Palestine who are also First Nations people engaged in a continuous difficult struggle for their lands and their sea. So the order of events today will be Hannah's going to read a section from Burnout, and then we'll have a little conversation, and then time permitting, we'll open it up to see if anyone's got any questions they'd like to pose to Hannah. Yeah, easy. Hannah, take it away.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks everyone for coming. It's very early in the morning here, so we're in slightly different headspaces, I guess. Yeah, so this is my book. I guess it's back to front. Burnout: The Emotional Experience of Political Defeat. It's structured around 8 concepts, all of which are quite depressing. So those are melancholia, nostalgia, depression, burnout, exhaustion, bitterness, trauma, and mourning. I'm going to read the epigraph to the book, which is from a Brecht poem. And then I'm going to read a tiny bit from the introduction and then a little bit from the afterword. But happy to talk about the actual middle bit of the book and some of the case studies that I touch on in the book, which, I mean, it kind of jumps around quite a lot historically and geographically. But yeah, maybe that's something we can talk about in the questions. Okay, so this is the epigraph to the book. You who will emerge again from the flood in which we have gone under, think, when you speak of our faults, of the dark times which you have escaped. For we went changing countries more often than our shoes, through the wars of the classes, despairing, when there was injustice only and no indignation. And yet we know hatred even of meanness makes you ugly, anger even at injustice makes your voice hoarse. Are we who wanted to prepare the land for friendliness, could not ourselves be friendly? You, however, when the time comes, when mankind is a helper unto mankind, think on us with forbearance. Okay, so this is just the very opening of the book. Change is hard. Living under capitalism can be physically damaging and mentally draining. The harms it inflicts are unevenly distributed. Overturning prevailing social and economic conditions is necessary and urgent, but change is hard. It's hard to change. People shaped by the societies they've grown up in transform in the process of trying to change them, breaking with habitual rhythms to organize collectively, forging solidarity with others against a common enemy, or gathering in the streets to fight injustice can alter lives forever, but struggles don't always continue. When movements are crushed, strategies fail, solidarity crumbles, energies wane, people turn on one another, or groups reproduce the oppressive dynamics of the structures they are fighting, the dejection incurred can be as psychologically profound as the elation that preceded it. Trying to reform, let alone overturn the existing state of things, can inflict its own mental wounds, especially when movements end in defeat or retreat. So my book considers emotional experiences of political defeat, disillusionment, and depletion in historical perspective, with chapters structured around the 8 concepts that I read out at the beginning. And it confronts the psychological toll of political struggle, asking how activists, organizers, and revolutionaries in various left-wing groups, parties, and liberation movements have worked through the emotional impacts of their political experiences, whether collectively or in isolation. Analysing the psychic aftermath of cycles of struggle, the emotional fallout of defeated movements, the ongoing strain of day-to-day organising spade work, and corrosive interpersonal tensions that emerge in radical political groups. The book responds to the psychological challenges of sustaining momentum over long periods. And so, yeah, I'm looking at this question in historical perspective, and my hope was to provide some resources for working through difficult emotional experiences as they arise. I'm not sure how much the book actually does that, but it was an attempt to think, the experiences that people might have in the present are not necessarily new. Yeah, okay, so now I'm going to read a little bit from the afterword. Sometime in the middle of a long pandemic winter in lockdown, I lost all sense of why I was writing this book, which is to say I lost all sense of hope. I wondered why I thought there might be any value in excavating experiences of defeat, in collaging loss, in cataloguing despair. During the UK student movement, which is nearly 15 years ago, I remember people enthusiastically passing around copies of philosopher Gillian Rose's Love's work with its epigraph, "Keep your mind in hell and despair not." While writing this book, I would sometimes think of those words, but I felt so angry. If people have to live in this hellish world while seeking to transform it, can't they at least feel despair? What if it isn't possible to believe in salvation, in redemption? What if it's all too hard to bear? I wondered what I thought I'd find when I started writing about burnout. Maybe I thought that by tracing emotional histories and confronting the difficulties of keeping going while attempting to overturn immiserating systems and oppressive structures, I could show how things might have been different or declare confidently that they could still be better. I wanted to be able to say, maybe it will be okay, and actually believe it. I wanted to say, here are some small things that people could do that might make it easier. I wanted to believe that these small things could work, could mean something, could all add up to something bigger, could help in the meantime. But instead, sitting alone in my room, I ended up thinking it was no fucking wonder that people lost their minds, couldn't carry on, gave up, fell out. No wonder they had nightmares, stayed in bed, ended their lives. I didn't think that any of the losses and repressions were inevitable, that people weren't right to have tried, that there couldn't have been other outcomes. But I felt like at some points, it felt hard to imagine that things could have been otherwise. Again and again, I kept coming to the same conclusion, which provides no consolation at all. Psychological experiences require patience, while so much in the world demands urgency. So in the book, I talk about this concept of sort of patient urgency, trying to articulate a contradiction between, the need to sort of act very urgently, but also to kind of be patient with oneself and others. I wrote the word hope and it clanged on the page. I thought of a line in a poem by Muriel Rukeyser written in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War, and it suddenly seemed to make sense of me. The terrible time when everyone writes hope. Having written all these words about despair and defeat, failure and loss, I suddenly imagined what it would have been like if I'd written a completely different book. What if I'd written a book about the future, about imagination, about prefigurative possibility, about fresh growth, about love, about overcoming past sufferings, about building a less pain-inflicting society? What if I had pictured a world in which pain-inflicting political struggle was no longer necessary? What if I had written a book about people stirred and moved and elated? What if I had written a book where even milk didn't turn sour? That's a reference to something earlier. What if I'd written a book about solidarity, about victory, about feeling really alive? What if I'd written a book about abolishing the family, private property, and the state, about tearing down prisons, about society without police? What if I'd written a book about what it feels like to pour forth onto the streets, what it feels like to win, what it could feel like to live otherwise? Sometimes I would read polemical books by my peers whose political arguments I broadly agreed with, and I would wonder why I couldn't just write like that too. I felt guilty for finding their tone tiring. I worried that it betrayed something reactionary or resigned, that I found myself constantly admitting ambivalence, equivocating, lacking assurance. But something about my subject, not just political defeat, but psychic life, resisted such treatment. I didn't want to ignore emotional difficulties, which made it difficult to reach any pat conclusions. After all, even in the extremely unlikely event of a global revolution, psychological distress will not simply disappear. And then I just talk about these two relatively recent books that kind of helped me feel a bit less hopeless. In Hannah Black's beautiful reimagining of the recent past of social democratic campaigns, pandemic, and anti-racist uprisings, that is also a vision of an alternative future, Tuesday or September or the end. The characters Dog and Bird, who are in a romantic relationship, embody a tension between reform and revolution. These two positions could in turn be mapped onto the tension between patience and urgency that I found myself crashing into over and over again. Black narrates the two modes as interdependent, mutually reinforcing. Quote, Dog wanted Bird to be a hopeless insurrectionist so that he could feel his own secret fidelity to sudden transformation still alive under layers of pragmatism and policy. Bird wanted Dog to believe in incremental progress in the abattoir of capitalism so that her inner sense of abyss could acquire walls and a floor. Bird searched for Dog in ground, and Dog searched in Bird for lightness and fire. Their difference was binding and animated their love, which was sometimes exhausting and mundane with the five-fingered chords of world history. Unquote. Even the ultimate lightness and fire of love can be tiring and mundane, and love requires work. At the end of the novel, riots erupt. In the crowds of people emerging from pandemic-induced isolation onto the streets, Bird briefly forgets to dwell on her past and experiences the rush of riot as medicinal and magical. Quote, the losses themselves were healed by the novelty of being with others, and not only that, but seeing police cars burn, and not only that, her soul rushed towards the riot. She had no opinion about her fate. The wheel of fortune spun wildly, the future was infinitely open. As the riots become revolution, as prisons open, as the police are abolished, as commodities are liberated from the value form, as the revolution becomes the ground of a new reality, the open future acquires walls and a floor. Spontaneity settles into consciousness and opens up a space for the unconscious. The healing process continues, but its medicine is not magical or instantaneous like the riot. It requires effort, time, and care. Black describes psychoanalytic groups meeting in empty lots and small groups of people gathering in the streets to talk about their past lives. The buried wounds of the past came up for air. A similar acknowledgement that past pains will not instantly be overcome, even if the world is transformed, underpins Emmy O'Brien and Eman Abdelhadi's Everything for Everyone, an oral history of the New York Commune 2052 to 2072, in which the imagined interviewees of the liberated future who are building communism in the ruins of the damaged and flooded world often reflect on their participation in communally organized innovative forms of lay therapy, group reflection, and trauma processing. These books imagine utopian post-revolutionary futures, but the futures they envisage are not hermetically sealed worlds that leave all scars behind. Reading them reassured me that attempting to write about psychic suffering was not antithetical to revolutionary political commitments, however disconsolate and demoralized doing so has sometimes left me feeling. But finding ways, methods, institutions, practices, infrastructures, concepts, and treatments capable of attending to these psychic issues is itself a vital political question. The revolutions imagined by these two new utopian books usher in the beginning of a process of healing rather than marking its end. And this is a quote from Hannah Black, fertilized by the new abundance of time, past pain, unfurled leaves on which were written a glowing scripture of a new life. Okay, I'll end it there, I think. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah. I'm literally having the experience of my friends all reading Love's Work by Gillian Rose at the moment. Like it's doing the circles of my friend group. And I also saw someone reading Everything for Everyone on the tram this morning. And I was a bit like, yeah.
Oh yeah, like Love's Work's back, like been released again, I think, as well, yeah.
Yeah, it's just like these texts stay and like reach our little like island. Okay, I guess I'll like ask my first question. It's like you open the book with a discussion of the defeat of Corbyn, um, particularly because that is one of your own key experiences of left defeat, as I kind of took it from reading the book. I was, I think, 23 years old and watching these disappointments, like over the internet or like mostly on Twitter and just seeing this like Corbyn and I think Sanders had these were seen as these possibilities of socialism in these like big empires and then watching that get crushed. And like had a very mediated experience of watching that. I just wanted to like hear you speak about like how did it almost how can you communicate how it felt to be within like being campaigning for Corbyn and like how did like this get you interested in like this experience of like their failure and like in the broader history of like left emotional experience, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, actually, the idea for the book predates I think the kind of when I started actually writing the book, it was like the very, very beginning of the first COVID lockdown in 2020. So that was like immediately after that kind of winter of sort of bleak campaigning in the rain. And so when I started actually writing the book, it was a very sort of fresh experience, actually. And so, I mean, I was like living in Germany for most of the Corbyn years. So I returned to the UK just in time for the defeat, basically. So I also did mostly experience that side of it. But yeah, I think it was that at the moment that I sort of began um, actually writing, that felt very sort of fresh experience, but it's a funny one because I feel like lots of different experiences have been sort of layered in as time goes on, and whatever period of time you're working on a project like this, people say, oh, this feels so timely and like exactly like it fits the present. um and a lot of people also assume like, oh, you must have written this because of X event or X experience, and then I'm usually like, no, actually it was about something else. So it is kind of interesting in a sense because now, like, I guess that defeat feels a little bit more less raw and kind of a bit more distant, and also a little bit more sort of surreal that it ever even happened. So it's also kind of funny how these things sort of shift. But I guess for me, the sort of initial experience that started me thinking about these questions long before I started actually working on the project was the defeat of the UK student movement, which was an earlier, yeah, sort of more like 2010, 2011. And the sort of aftermath of that, and like I guess also experiences of sort of police repression and yeah, all of that kind of was definitely also informed which is obviously also very different from a more like kind of parliamentary project. Yeah.
Yeah, and you also talk a lot about like the miners' strikes in the 70s and like Thatcher's like just horrific reign against the like miners, and like one of the like lovely examples is like the women's support of the mining strike against the ultimate failure of the strike as well. And it's like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was also sort of thinking about my own like life span, because I was born the year that Corbyn was elected to Parliament, which was in the early 80s, which was just before the miners' strike, um, which yeah was 1984 to 85. And I was like reading all of this work by Stuart Hall about that was kind of asking about like, why is it that Thatcher keeps winning? Like, why does the left keep getting defeated? And it was also, there was some of the stuff was about the defeat of the Labour left as well under Michael Foot in the 80s. So I think in the kind of wake of the Corbyn defeat, I sort of found myself reading about that period quite a bit because some of it seemed to kind of resonate with the experience of the present, but also yeah, I think I turned to the kind of oral histories of the miners' strike because I was looking for a counterpart to these more sort of theoretical accounts of left melancholia, which I found to be very interesting and helpful, but they weren't really about the sort of really immediate emotional experience of having lived through something. And so I turned to these accounts of these are oral histories of women who were involved in supporting the miners' strike through kind of running like solidarity kitchens and things like this in mining communities. And most of them were gathered in like really, really soon after the defeat. And so they really capture something of the sort of emotional rawness of that as an experience. And so it's much less about people reflecting on questions of kind of political strategy or talking about the sort of long-term economic impact of Thatcherism on Britain or something like that. They're much more about what it was like to live through this moment of intense political organizing and solidarity, and what it felt like to be so brutally defeated.
Yeah, because like the next question I had was like on this like question of like left melancholia, because like I very much read the book as like trying to break open the like left melancholia like phrasing in the way that Wendy Brown does in that essay, because it's termed as like left melancholia is just something to be resisted because it leaves us like stuck facing the past and we can't deal with the present, but there's no real like mechanism in that. And the way you kind of like contrast like Brown's essay to the Douglas Crimp's essay about mourning, the other bit of that Freud mourning and melancholy section. I just wanted you to speak more on like how you saw just like the left melancholia and breaking that open to like the 8 other aspects that you draw out in your book, but also like the way you like, I feel like you kind of pose the like resisting left melancholia against the Douglas Crimp's essay, Mourning and Militancy, and
Mm.
speak more on that.
Yeah, so I reread Wendy Brown's famous essay, Resisting Left Melancholy, which was written in the late 90s, and it feels very much like it belongs to that kind of moment. And it's a really, I mean, it's a great essay in a lot of ways, but it's very zoomed out. Like she's talking about, I guess, this kind of epochal post like post 1989 sort of the position of the Western left in this very, very zoomed out way. And so it's kind of thinking about it's not thinking, it doesn't really, it's not really interested in the experience of sort of people who have like lived through and been kind of involved in struggles and the emotional experience on a sort of personal level or interpersonal level that comes from those experiences. It's much more about a kind of disposition, I guess. And so it's treating it in this quite mm, yeah, it feels quite remote from the sorts of emotional questions that I was interested in exploring, which is not to say that it's not like a helpful um or kind of quite powerful essay. I just think it's about a very different phenomenon than the thing that I was interested in. And I think, you know, that it's an important point that she has, which is that the danger of getting like overly attached to, like the danger of a sort of affective attachment to a kind of impossibility or yeah, which I think is helpful. I mean, Rodrigo Nunes's book, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, opens with a discussion of Wendy Brown's essay and puts it in dialogue with Jodie Dean's later reconceptualization of left melancholy. And like, you know, I think that's a really useful chapter in his book. But his book is about very different things to my book, which is that, you know, his book is much more about sort of strategy and organizing and how, you know, how to kind of overcome these things within the context of sort of from a perspective of kind of organizing, whereas I guess I'm thinking about or just the experience of how heavy and kind of difficult like really emotional experience can be in different movements and the importance of taking those experiences seriously. And I think also from, you know, the Wendy Brown essay ends with almost this like joke about like a sort of almost like a joke about therapy. And it's kind of, it makes sense that it would be a joke because she's so far removed from kind of people's everyday lives. And I was sort of more interested in thinking like, well, actually, there are loads of examples of people who did think that they needed to go into therapy after these kinds of experiences and who maybe also were very critical of mainstream understandings of, you know, psychiatry or psychoanalysis, but who nonetheless felt like it was important or necessary to kind of think about these kinds of therapeutic questions. So I sort of felt like, oh, actually, I want to take that kind of seriously. Yeah, the last chapter of the book is on mourning. And I return to Douglas Crimp's essay, Mourning and Militancy. And he really kind of reconceptualizes Freud's understanding of mourning within the context of a political movement where I guess if the cause of your loss, the loss that's being mourned, has a sort of political origin, then it's not possible to do what Freud kind of suggests in Mourning and Melancholia, which is, that ideally you kind of mourn the lost object and move on. But it's kind of impossible to do that in a context where the violence and injustice is ongoing. And so this is where a kind of more politicized understanding of mourning is sort of necessary. Yeah.
Yeah. I I feel like in Jodie Dean's also partially trying to take up again this kind of like old school like militant communism as well. It was just like very like pro the party, very I would from what I read of her, I struggle to see like any real room for like the morning practices or like therapeutic practices in it.
Oh no, that would be bourgeois individualism for
Yeah.
Jodie Dean, for sure, 100%.
Yeah.
That would just be like, yeah, very bad.
Yeah. Um yeah, I also like feel like at least like in some of the like circles that like I'm in, it does feel like that kind of like bourgeois individualism, like in a sarcastic way, is like the feelings and emotions that like Dean would be dismissing is like they're like coming back and they're being like privileged again, to better and for worse. Like you have this like incredible Substack article called the Against Capacity one, which I send around a lot and I think about all the time. Just like this like vagueness in like communication that is ultimately about just like someone not feeling like they want to do something for better or for worse. And then like this comes into play, but I think it's also without these like communal practices of like the self-criticism sessions or like the consciousness raising sessions or even like the kind of like more extreme example of like the really intense group therapy that like the Red Therapy Collective were doing in the 70s. And I
Mhm.
also think this is like maybe a separate point, but I also feel like psychoanalysis like is emerging again. It like came up with Marcuse, but seems to be happening again with as like a discourse and a practice which is of use to the left, which is still like very focused on the individual, like like an Sand goes to the analyst. It's a closed room. It's just those two. It's ultimately just the singular person and their unconscious. I guess um, what do you make of like this kind of shift in your research and like in your writing and thinking, I guess?
Yeah, it's really interesting, I think, because you're right that there's like it's not the case now that in most organizing contexts people would be dismissed for, there's I think there's much more of an attentiveness to psychological questions and a concern about things like burnout and a kind of um yeah, there has been this resurgence of interest theoretically in kind of left approaches to psychoanalysis and to kind of histories of radical psychiatry. There's like a bazillion books about like Fanon, especially from like his psychiatric work and like on kind of institutional psychotherapy in France and like anti-psychiatry. And yeah, there's like this kind of, I think also like I've definitely done talks with like people in political groups where they feel like in some ways maybe there's almost too much emphasis in on like checking in and kind of all of and maybe then I was trying to think about the difference as I've been doing these interviews actually in the last couple of weeks with members of this group Red Therapy who formed in London in the 1970s. They're all in their early 80s now mostly. And they've been sort of talking about that sort of period. And I think, yeah, like the thing that does feel quite different is that they set up their own radical therapy group and were experimenting with different practices. Um, and so it wasn't that there wasn't this sort of division where you go off and do therapy within a kind of mainstream institutional context and then like return to your political organizing. There was an attempt to sort of integrate the two. And I suppose maybe it also feels like there was more of a, I think sometimes one thing that I guess I was trying to think about in the book was if you have to sort of historically situate the concepts and vocabularies that, we use to make sense of the psyche. And I think obviously in the 60s and 70s, there was this really sort of pervasive mistrust of mainstream psychiatry and sort of, so the idea would be that like the left would need its own sort of concepts and practices and theories. And I wonder if maybe a difference now is that there's less of a sort of interrogation of the language and concepts and more of a sort of sense that, oh, we just kind of use concepts that are like in the DSM or whatever uncritically. And that I don't know, that's just one thing that I've been thinking about. But it's been interesting talking to the people in red therapy, because I think on the one hand they're really like, oh, it's cool that there seems to be this interest in this thing that we did in the 70s. But we were also talking about a lot of the major differences. I mean, and some of those differences are just kind of very different, like materially things were very different for them because they were able to basically like live in squats and basically just like do political organizing all the time, and then also just do this red therapy group. And like, yeah, it was just like a very different kind of moment because you could just sort of live on the dole and live in a squat, and kind of politics could be your life in a way that I think now is very different. So yeah, it's an interesting question though, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel like so many of the people I know involved in these circles are like either like students where like there is more time, but then there's the real thing of like once you've finished like university, you have to get a job, you have to like pay rent, or like the squats are like far fewer between, or they're just much more heavily policed as well. Um, that like it just seems to be like such a like different shift that maybe it's just like it's individual because the neoliberal subject is just more intense than it was in the past, unfortunately. Yeah. And yeah, I guess like the thing that like impressed me about the book was just like the range of sources that you drew on. Like I think I heard you say in the interview that you chose to go like wide as opposed to like deep in your research. Like you chose to like find as many examples as you could, as opposed to like picking a couple examples and just thoroughly researching them. Because like you go from the like New York feminists and they're interested in like consciousness raising to like the Paris Commune and also to like their exile in New Caledonia, but also like Maoist practices and like state repression and resistance in Chile. Like there's references not just from like the Western canon. Like you could have easily written a book about the Paris Commune and that effect, but you didn't. And you also reference like lots of like literary stuff. Like you reference like Sean Bonney, you reference like all these incredible like films and like fiction writers. Like why was this variety of like sources important for the work and for like creating this like archive, I guess, of like political experience?
I mean, I think it was just a case of like trying to think about how to get at the type of thing that I was trying to talk about. And so sometimes it was like, I sort of, it was like if I found something, I would sort of know that it fit my idea of what the book was. But it took a while before I decided to structure it around concepts. And that I think I decided then also that I didn't want to have like just one case study per chapter, because I felt like it was important that it was about these kind of conceptual questions where the specificity of the kind of context being discussed is, of course, really important. But at the same time, I wanted to basically draw these connections across time and space, not to say that it's completely transhistorical or that to kind of flatten out the differences, but I think I was trying to kind of get at certain things that hopefully people could read about a completely different context and recognize something. And I think I also I very deliberately, I didn't want to write about just one kind of left-wing tradition. And so I include people from very different, like left, like, from like anarchists to like real ultra leftists to more kind of like social democrats. I mean, it's quite ecumenical in that sense as well, politically. Like it includes people who definitely like would have major political differences with one another. So I didn't, and I wanted it to have these kind of like sort of jumps from more orthodox left. You know, there's a bit that's about the aftermath of the October Revolution, but I also wanted it to have this more kind of yeah, like talking about more like new left sort of stuff. So I that was kind of that was conscious. Um Again, not to sort of say that all of these experiences are identical, but I think it was like I wanted it to have a kind of eclecticism, and not to feel too much like it had its own sort of party line. Um, yeah, and I think the other thing that it does is it kind of includes very kind of not particularly extreme experiences, like, you know, the aftermath of the Corbyn defeat in the UK, where, you know, maybe people felt a bit sad, but it wasn't like really severe. But I did also want to include much more, you know, extreme experiences of political repression. You know, so I do talk about, yeah, like the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile and like the coup in 1973, and I talk about the mass murder of communists in Indonesia in the mid 1960s. And that's because I felt like it was important to sort of, yeah, think about these kinds of, again, like obviously not to draw an equivalence between those much more extreme experiences and more mundane ones, but that I felt like in some ways they did belong in this kind of broad history of kind of left emotional experience. Um, but yeah, it was a kind of an interesting, um, it was an interesting process because it felt kind of like I like once when I would find a source that I felt like spoke to the thing I was trying to get at, then I would know what it was. But it wasn't like I knew in advance what I was looking for. And I think it was also that it felt like, yes, sometimes it felt like artworks and things like this just were the places where this kind of emotional world was kind of explored in a way that, I mean, I guess it's just a fact that, you know, if movements fall apart, they stop documenting themselves. So in a sense, it's like it's actually not always easy to find sources about things going really wrong and people feeling really, really bad or whatever. Um, yeah, especially when you're not, you know, obviously if you were doing a really like deep archival project on one particular struggle, that would be a bit different. But especially the fact that I was kind of ranging around so much. Yeah, but yeah, I did also have a kind of rule, which is that I don't kind of take an existing concept from, say, psychoanalysis and apply it to the sources that I'm looking at. So like one of the things that I guess I'm doing methodologically is I'm trying to work with sources where I'm trying to get at like how people described their own experiences. And so even something like mourning and militancy, like Douglas Crimp was actually involved in ACT UP. And so the reconceptualization of Freud that he came up with is coming from an experience within a political movement. And so it was kind of like I was interested in looking at sources where that was the case rather than me kind of coming up with the concept, if you like.
Yeah, and like that crimp essay like opens with him kind of having a bit of a go at someone who's trying to do this like hyper abstract, like I think like Derridean language analysis on an ACT UP slogan. Just kind of was like, mate, what are you doing? This has like political meaning and weight. And yeah, because like my last question before we open up to the floor is that I think the thing that I find like striking and pretty refreshing is like in the book, and this is like partly due to like focus on historical sources, is like the lack of discussion of the internet. Just because I feel like there's a real focus on like how bad the internet makes us feel and how difficult it is to organize political stuff with the internet, both as like a collector of data, but also like the way it affects like us emotionally. Um, but I also just kind of wanted to like invite you to talk a bit about your reflections on like this like online left culture and like in these experiences of defeat. Like I think the way that people are acting online at the moment with Trump is fascinating, if not kind of horrifying. Um, yeah, so I just wanted to see what your reflections were on like the online culture and in this like moment of left defeat and of left emotional experience.
Mm. Yeah, it's an interesting one because it's an interesting question because it's not something that I did particularly consciously. And I think there were times in the book where I tried to draft things that did try to kind of like at some point I was quite interested in how certain sort of ideas about like radical care get kind of memeified and certain sorts of, or you see certain slogans from like, I don't know, like Audre Lorde or something circulating in this slightly memeified way where the kind of original context and its political meaning is a bit lost when it gets converted into this little kind of social media thing. So I was thinking about that. But it's true that I think a lot of people obviously talk a lot about the kind of forms of, I guess, paranoia and like also I think intense, like something that I've noticed that can happen as well, like the sense that if people aren't posting about something, they don't care about it. So there can be this kind of intense moralizing around how people use the internet. Mm, and a kind of sense of sort of um yeah, a slightly sort of hectoring tone that can come, but and that like then if your relationships with people that you organize with are mediated through these kind of strange, posting really sort of like righteous Instagram stories is like maybe not the most like helpful thing to do. And like yeah, but it's interesting that I it wasn't super conscious that it's, I mean, I guess obviously, like you said, it's a historical book, so most of the examples that I'm looking at are like pre-internet. But obviously, I also talk about some of my own experiences, which are obviously not pre-internet. But I think I also didn't want it to be a book about like, yeah, like the Twitter left or something like that. Yeah, but yeah, it is. Yeah, it's an interesting one to try and think about how you could write about it in a way that wasn't yeah, because I think the internet can obviously like produce a lot of like bad feeling and mis like misunderstanding and stuff. But it's also, I suppose, how people meet one another. I mean, I guess the against capacity thing was quite a lot about like WhatsApp groups more than it were, or like signal groups and the sort of that as a form of a sort of weird form of organizing where you're kind of where lots of people are only interacting in this kind of messaging environment and it's like yeah, a bit decontextualized or something.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely like my experience, like of it, of like someone who like end of last year just like deleted Instagram. But then I had this conversation with a friend who was also like, Instagram is this tool for like Palestinians in Palestine to like broadcast like their actual conditions as opposed to like the mainstream news like account of what's happening. And it has like this weird dual effect of like it is like it is a tool, but also like it does seem to affect like the way we interact with each other. And yeah.
Yeah, there's not like an easy solution to it, I think, because that's also, I think, and like for all that I'm sort of criticizing people for being overly righteous, it's also like I get it, like I get why it's important also to kind of, you know, do that. I don't think it is like there's an easy answer to it, really.
Yeah. Didn't solve that one, damn it. Um,
So,
I guess I'll open up now to the floor if anyone's got a question. You can either put it in the chat and I can read it out, or you can unmute yourselves, I believe.
Maybe I'll start then.
Yep.
Um,
Someone's used the hand emoji, Jim. So
oh,
hand
Nick,
out.
so go.
It's all right, Jim. I'm happy for you to go first. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I just haven't got a working camera,
Um,
sorry.
just Hannah, back near the beginning when you're reading, you were reading from the afterward, I think, about what the book could have been, about all the positive things you could have written about. and I couldn't help having this feeling of, in terms of the subject matter you're writing about, you're the Ken Loach of um, this, sphere. And the other people that came to my mind were from the 1970s, and they're probably still around, Hugh Bainan and Nichols. Hugh Bainan wrote the book Working for Ford, and then he collaborated with Nichols on writing about other working class experiences. But what was so strong about their book was that it was about how the political, I'll call it political formation, they're probably the wrong words, of working class people came out of their daily experiences of living. And you're capturing the experiences of us being involved in political struggle. And that's what I really love. And whereas all the other things you talked about the book that could have been, all the other variants, weren't really based on our lived experiences, if you like.
Mm. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, and it's true that it's not really about sort of everyday life in the broader sense. It's quite narrowly about experiences within political movements and sort of parties and struggles. Although I guess you could write a book about like uh like a really like affirmative experience on a picket line, or like a really amazing demonstration, or a campaign that like won, or like, I guess you could sort of do that.
So just to cut across, it, it's a book about my life. Your book is about my life since the 1970s.
Yeah, that's yeah. But yeah, but you didn't, yeah, you kept going, I guess. So I don't know if anyone read the book by Vincent Bevins, If We Burn, which is about the sort of mass protests movements of the 2010s and their defeats. But it does actually end on this. It's kind of a book about like why horizontalism went wrong in so many different contexts, kind of. And like he's really talking about places where the political repression was like very extreme, like in Egypt, or he talks about, like these kinds of places. But then he interviews loads and loads of activists in all of these different places. And one of the things that he says that they all end up saying is like, they all get really, they're all kind of still very fixated on the moment when the movement was at its height, and like when it really felt like something positive was going to happen, and that like for all that they're kind of really defeated, there's still this kind of attachment to that kind of this moment of possibility where it felt like something else might happen, and that there's a sense in which they're really like changed by that experience, and that they still hold on to it even in the kind of depths of defeat or something. It's like that's like the last 2 pages of his book or something. It's quite cool.
It's literally the book I'm going to read next. I'm very much like looking forward to it. And it's like, because he like is really tracking the like I've read the Jakarta method, which you also like write about in your book, about this like intense um like repression that is faced, but there's always these moments of like things could have been different that people seem to hold on to. The other person who wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. And thank you, Hannah. My name is Nick. I don't know why it says what it says up there. It's just a mixed up version of my actual name. But yeah, and thank you, Hannah, for the book, which I read. I got it for Christmas and read it straight away because I was really interested in how you thought about both, well, all of the things you wrote about. I was especially struggling with the idea of defeat. Um, and I've recommended your book to other people who've bought it, and we've been talking about it. So it's been really helpful and useful, and yeah, I got a lot. I am still getting a lot out of it. So thank you for that. I am still struggling with defeat. I'm trying to write about defeat myself. But I am struggling with it. A friend of mine described me on the weekend as an incurable optimist. Um, and I wonder about the use of the term, and you discuss this quite a lot in the book. Um, in fact, you seem a bit firmer today about what is defeat and what isn't defeat, which is something I still struggle with, like, you know, um, are the Palestinian people defeated, that sort of question. Um, and I I'm not sure how old Jim is, but I've lived over a lot of that same period. And while I've considered certain things defeats, I've then questioned whether they are, because I think, it's difficult. There's something final about defeat that I don't like. Um, and I still sense and feel and live with that moment of possibility. So even though at times I have definitely felt defeated, I tend not to, and I try not to, and I'm very wary about defeatism. Um, Nonetheless, I think your stuff about grief and it being ongoing is a really important lesson and consideration that we all need to sort of, um, well, take to heart and appreciate. Nonetheless, um, I I think your book is a work of love, and I really would like to hear more about what you think about care as an antidote to burnout.
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess this question about defeat is complicated because sometimes it's used it can feel like it's used to kind of talk about this very definitive moment, like historical moments, right? But obviously within any of those kinds of experiences are like so many different people who then go, it's not like they necessarily just like, obviously there are examples of people who then, revoke their political commitments or withdraw completely. But for all that, there's always examples of so many people who then continue in different ways. And yeah, that's never like just a kind of completely definitive. I didn't want the word defeat to be in the title of the book. That was Verso's doing. But yeah, and I think, yeah, whether one individual, like whether people, like an experience of a political defeat doesn't necessarily lead to a kind of, yeah, like a defeatist political attitude, right? Yeah, and I think that is what's so kind of beautiful about this bit in this Vincent Bevins book in a way, is that it's like people who have really been, like who are really like now like political prisoners and things, but it's not like they're therefore, given up on the possibility of something happening again in the future, even though the defeats that they've experienced are very, big. Yeah, and I guess, yeah, it's a tricky one, I think. In terms of the question of care, I think it's a term that I think is kind of a complicated one, because obviously care, like to care for someone, to care about someone, it's such a broad term, and I think it's obviously like care can be, it's not necessarily always positive, right? Like obviously care can also be sort of violent or like ambivalent, or I think it's like one needs to be very careful about what is being spoken about. And so yes, I think that one thing that I do try to talk about in the book is the importance of trying to embed some of these kinds of questions of care within political movements, but obviously that also involves asking like, well, what do we mean by that? Yeah, and like what does it, like what does that actually look like in practice? Yeah, so, and like again, like I guess I don't necessarily have a neat answer to that, but I do think yeah, the reason that I wrote the book and wrote about all of these really depressing things was obviously not because I'm writing from a sort of position of like affirming defeat and despair. I think it was from the position of feeling like I'd seen how damaging and difficult these kinds of experiences can be. And it was a question of trying to think, not just pretend that they don't happen, but try to kind of acknowledge them as a way of kind of hopefully figuring out ways of kind of dealing with them and overcoming them, which isn't the same as ignoring them or something like that, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's so nice to hear people, yeah, reading and engaging with the book.
Yeah,
Oh, there's a question in the chat, I think.
yeah, like Grady's point is on that. I'll just read it out if that's all good. It's just like Grady says, I'm curious about the place of hope in sustaining ongoing political struggle, and supplementary to that, how necessary as a foundation is a conviction about the superiority of an idea or cause, and also the plausibility of an idea and cause.
Yeah. I guess I got a bit skeptical about hope when I was writing the book. And I think now maybe I have a slightly different perspective on it, but I end the book with this quote from Mike Davis, which says, fight with hope, fight without hope, but fight absolutely. Like you don't need hope in order to fight, although maybe that's not. I wonder if there's a difference between hope as a practice and hope as a feeling, like, and it's possible. Or like I don't know if people have read this piece by John Berger about Palestine where he talks about undefeated despair. Like there's a kind of these kind of slightly more contradictory ways of thinking about you obviously in order to act politically a kind of against the odds, I guess you do have to have some sort of hope that there's a point to doing that, right? But at the same time, maybe it's not a completely naive thing to, or it's one that can also kind of acknowledge the sort of scale of the challenges that are being faced or something like that. So it's kind of, I think, maybe holding these things together. I think the thing that I'd become skeptical about is that I felt like when I came to write the conclusion to my book, I feel like there's this kind of way of writing, hopefully, in sort of a kind of particular left-wing sort of rhetoric, where it's kind of like, and I know how to do it, like I can write a conclusion like that. And I sort of almost went into autopilot and just did it. And then I was like, wait, no, like I guess it sort of felt a bit antithetical to the book. And which is why I think I was because I guess for me it felt like, oh, but if you're critical of hope, does that mean that you're kind of reneging on your political principles? But I think I came to think like, no, that's not quite the same thing. Which is why I kind of developed this slight skepticism about, not about hope, but about, I guess, a particular like invoking hope rhetorically in a way that didn't really quite feel like it had that much substance to it or something. It felt a bit desperate or a bit kind of shallow or something, if that makes sense. But obviously, yeah, it's a complicated question. Yeah, and I think one that I've carried on thinking about and have found it interesting talking to people about since the book's come out. Yeah, and then the second part of the question, how necessary as a foundation is a conviction about the superiority of an idea cause? Plausibility of an idea cause. I think you have to have a political conviction, maybe. I think the question of plausibility, I think I'm not that I'm quite okay with having political convictions that aren't plausible, or at least, or like maybe the concept, this kind of abolitionist concept of like non-reformist reform is quite helpful for that, because it's like your horizon of, you have to, like, you can have a revolutionary horizon that, you know, in some sense is not immediately plausible in a sense, but I think it's still important that like one's politics are informed by like horizons that are not necessarily ones that might be like immediately realizable. I think that's important. And I think that can be then combined with like a kind of more pragmatic approach to political strategy in the immediate term. But I think it's important to hold on to implausible implausible political positions in a sense. Which yeah, if that I yeah, because yeah, to me that seems and that maybe that yeah, to me that seems also even kind of important, even if it doesn't necessarily inform what you're doing on a sort of more like day-to-day practical basis in terms of like organizing, but it might inform, yeah, some of the more underlying things. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like the point is to like make it plausible, like try and do the work to make the implausible an actual thing that could happen. And yeah, and if no one else has any questions or comments, I might wrap it up. And thank you so much for joining us, Hannah. This was such a great conversation. If you haven't read the book, I'm sure this was an excellent advertisement to buy the book, preferably from NIBS, but you can get it other places if you so choose. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you again, Hannah.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your questions and everything. Been really nice.
Listen,
Thanks.
thank you.